Hi, thank you for coming. My name is Laura Hall, and when we were talking about the stuff that we were going to discuss in this whole session, we agreed that I was going to go deep into theory behind the choices that we make in order to do environmental storytelling. So I'm going to say a lot in a very limited amount of time, and in order to do that, I'm going to go really, really fast. So if you can just bear with me. So yeah, telling stories in spaces without saying anything out loud. My name is Laura Hall. I live in Portland. I'm not going to read everything out loud, but you know, I've just been drawn to this sort of storytelling my entire life. Like if there's a house, I want it to be haunted, basically. I make lots of things: escape rooms, immersive experiences, alternate reality games, books, as Gabe mentioned, street games, card games, and a lot of stuff that isn't really easy to define, as I'm sure you're familiar with that kind of stuff. Here's some of that stuff that I've worked on recently. I work in advertising as well. So yeah, we're going to get really deep into the theory behind this sort of design work. And the thing about that is these were all things that we understood intuitively. When we were working on these projects, we knew that there was a need for it. And so the stuff that we'll discuss today is sort of working backwards from that to try and understand how we reached those spaces in the finished creative work. And I could easily fill an entire day talking about this stuff. I'm going to reference two of my projects as we go through this. The first is Spark of Resistance, the first escape room that I built with a bunch of colleagues in Portland. It's a spy drama set in an alternate universe, kind of Cold War era dystopia. And also The Silence in Room 1258, which ran at Now Play This in London last year. That is a self-paced examination of ephemera from a 1930s Hollywood hotel after a paranormal incident. It's based in an antique desk, and it's totally self-directed and self-paced. The players, as it were, choose how much of the material they want to read. They choose when they have when they feel that they have received as much of the information as they want, they can walk away. And these, to me, represent the two ends of the spectrum of the type of work that I do. The escape rooms, super high pressure, timed experiences that are extremely linear. And then the totally self-directed stuff, which is sort of whatever you as an audience member want it to be. So how many people here have actually done an escape room? All right, okay. Great. So I'll just skip all the explanation stuff. But in my experience, often when you show up in an escape room, or a lot of experiences really, you have this sense of anticipation. You don't really know what's going to be inside. It's a complete mystery box. Probably excited, maybe also a little bit scared. So you show up, and then the first thing that happens is you get a long speech about the world and about what you're supposed to be doing in it. And you're just sitting, you're looking at a person. Okay, so then you get led into the space, and you're like, okay, I'm hyping myself up again. I'm really excited for this. And the first thing you get handed is like a laminated piece of paper, top to bottom, full of text, also about the world and what you're supposed to be doing in it. And I'll give you one guess about how much of that story stuff anybody in that room remembers. It's nothing, absolutely nothing. So 4 years ago, when my colleagues and I decided to build an escape room, the first thing we were asking ourselves is like, how do we turn the equivalent of a huge wall of text into something more like this? First shot of A New Hope, Star Destroyer, a planet, and a tiny ship. You know exactly what's going on. Or even this. Like, I take this in a room, you know? It's evocative, it's powerful, it's memorable, and you hear that music come up and you know exactly how you're supposed to feel about the story that you're about to see. So that was our first challenge. There is a second part to it, though. When I sit down to make a game of any kind, I'm thinking of one thing, one feeling that I want people to experience. So. Yeah. Oops, shit. The bad button. Yes. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So to me, this is an example of the power of a sort of pure childlike feeling of play. Everybody knows this feeling. Maybe not this exact feeling. But, there's a sense of transportation that comes with that. It's a cathartic experience. It's very physical. And it exists in that ephemeral, sort of intensely personal moment. So the challenge for me has been, how do you combine this feeling of a playful body in a space with a story that transports you but isn't distracting or pointless? A lot of narrative media achieves that transcendence. Books have had, 550 years or so to get to the point where you can totally lose yourself in them. Films have had more than 100 years. And it feels like we're sort of still on the verge of getting there with this stuff, which is really exciting to me. So my challenge has been, how do I combine that feeling, something completely internal, with the external, which is the narrative and story that I need to get across using a specific environment. So I'll start with what I call designing for the subconscious. When you sit down to design something, it's sometimes easy to forget that we're talking about real bodies and real spaces. So the first step is narrowing in on what's happening inside people's brains when they're actually entering our spaces that we've built. And cognitively, there's a lot going on. It's easy to see that happening in a theater space. People have literally crossed a threshold into another world. The lights go down, their heart rate kind of is increasing, their eyes are dilating and focusing on stuff, as their brains are sort of keying into what's happening. So the brain basically is entering survival mode, right? It's presented with this huge mystery that it then needs to face and untangle. And then once that switch has happened, once people are sort of in that intensely focused moment, we're asking them to process a ton of information, to solve puzzles, to take in a story, or whatever the case is. So how do we communicate with the brain when it doesn't really want to receive information except the very most essential stuff? I'm going to show you a video. It's important that you follow the instructions carefully. So.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make? The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Pretty good. So that's more generally known as the invisible gorilla experiment. It's a great example of how brains and bodies do really weird things when they're under pressure. You see this play out in escape rooms all the time. Just as a personal example, in our first room we had a giant blaring siren anytime we sent a hint through a screen that was also very prominent and well lit. And people would be so intensely focused and so far into the flow state, they would not hear it. So you have people behind the scenes pushing the button over and over, and it's like a klaxon. They didn't hear it. So that was sort of, again, in this idea of watching the design and then working backwards to explain it, that was one of the first cues about what was actually going on. There's going to be a video playing, but we don't have to actually stop, and I'll just mute it too. So another funny lizard brain survival mode thing that happens is that we love to look for patterns, right? Does this sink kind of look angry or upset? It does to me. Also playing is the hide or simul illusion, which is a demonstration of how people love to come up with a narrative for something even when nothing is actually happening. So long story short, we love to read too much into stuff, and that's the number 2 thing to remember. Yeah, you can watch the angry triangle. See, it's angry, right? Anyway. So number 1, we're focused so intensely that we're actually distracted. Number 2, we're processing so much information so quickly that we're seeing things that aren't actually there, which is exhausting. There's a real thing called brain fatigue. We only have so much processing power in there before we need to recharge our batteries. That power is spent very quickly when you're throwing lots of stuff at people. And I use the example of the car salesman because they front load all of the stuff that requires lots and lots of cognitive processing, lots of little nitpicky details. And then at the end comes the expensive stuff by default, so that by that time you're too tired to actually make those choices. Yeah. So, number one, we're so focused that we're actually distracted. 2, we're processing so much information, seeing so much that's not there. And 3, we're being tired out by it. So the lesson, don't put in extra stuff because nobody will notice it. If they do notice it, they'll think it's important. And if it's not important and they notice it, it's a waste of their time. Don't put in text unless it's absolutely vital, and almost all the time it's not. And then let the design of the environment, props, puzzles, and interactions do the heavy lifting of conveying the setting, mission, etc. And we will talk about what that actually means. So, sorry. In Spark of Resistance, the escape room that we made back in 2014, players are told that they're secret agents who need to infiltrate the propaganda office. The person whose office it belongs to is a deep agent. They're super deep undercover. They've missed a check-in, so we don't know what's happened to them. They haven't been actively communicating with this resistance. So you, as the audience, need to go in, investigate, find out what's happened. So here's how it plays out over the course of the hour. So the first puzzle leads players to a tape recorder. They hear this message: if you're listening to this, I'm in big trouble, you need to help me out. Obviously, they're the only ones who are clever enough to sort of infiltrate that space, so it's okay to leave this message in this very dystopian environment. So then a couple puzzles go by, and players send a key card to the spy character through a message tube system. So in the fiction, that's when the character first becomes aware of the players within that space. They send a message back, written on the next puzzle. It's a little vague. It's this sort of handwritten text. They use this information to distract a security guard and send the path to our spy that we're helping out. Then we watch a video of them evading the guard and escaping. Then they face the camera and directly address the audience. And basically they betray them. So it says, you're now on your own, you have to get yourself out, I'm saving myself, bye. So every puzzle in that scenario moves them forward in their task of investigating the office and helping the spy. Each one grants them slightly more knowledge about the world, the dystopian world, kind of via an increasing security level and access to different information. And it's done with only a couple of lines of dialogue, a really short video, and that handwritten message. So for each of those moments, we boiled down the plot and narrative points down so that it was the very most essential components, because we knew that people wouldn't be able to process anything more than that. If it was more complicated than a single sentence description of what was happening, people would maybe participate in the physical action of doing those things, but they wouldn't actually know what was going on. Then the environment, object design, and puzzle mechanics handled the rest. So how do we design that rich narrative that can handle that type of heavy lifting? In this context, understanding the cognition and processing load was what guided us in making choices about the environment and what we placed in it, with the ultimate goal of never breaking the illusion for people. We used world building, diegesis, and internal logic of the world as a way to ground people in the reality when their cognitive and physical capabilities were overloaded. Because you're relying on the players to build that mental model of the world, you're providing as much suggestion of that world as possible. So what are they actually familiar with? What can you kind of rely on that they will actually know? And this is where the other media, the movies and the books, physical and otherwise, come into play. There's a lot of stuff that shares qualities with escape rooms, theater, haunted houses, and movie and theatrical design. So there's lots and lots of material that we can draw from in how to communicate similar things that we're trying to achieve. So in your mind, when you think of an office, you're probably picturing something like this, right? It's fluorescent lights, it's messy, maybe not as messy as this. Maybe you're into design, so it's a little cleaner, but there's lots of sort of utilitarian real stuff, right? It's cables and mail and your lunch or the empty containers from it. But this is not something that's fun to experience. It's something we all experience a lot of the time. So then an office in a film or on television tends to be pretty similar. It's evoking the same sort of stuff. You know, it's all these beige cubicles to convey how boring offices really are, which I am assuming is why we've all gotten into this kind of line of work, so we don't have to be in offices. And then these are some of the offices that we looked at when we were designing our space, right? Dystopian stuff, actual Stasi prison offices, which, like, the aesthetic of those is surprisingly good. You should really look those up because they're kind of beautiful in a weird way. And then the lives of others as well, which is sort of set in this time period that we wanted to evoke. You know, each of these is saying a specific message about the world. Brazil, super, super exaggerated. Lives of others, extremely realistic. So we drew from both of those. And then here's sort of what we came up with. You know, sparse furnishing, propaganda posters, ducts as a reference to Brazil, banks of 80s style technology, because we knew that those were the sort of things people would expect to see. So we deliberately evoked the sense of otherworldliness and oppression by referencing things that we knew were in the back of their minds already. Again, and it's without ever stating any of this in actual words. So those choices were also pleasantly validated by the release of the film The Double, which is a very similar story and similar settings. And like all of their lighting cues and color palettes were exactly the same. So we were like very pleased with ourselves for kind of nailing that. So then the other thing that we adhered to for efficiency of communication, again, because people are working against time limit in that scenario, and like it's kind of a sin to waste their time if you're asking them to race against a clock, it was diegesis of puzzles. And I won't get super deep into this because, again, we only have the 20 minutes. But there's library books, commonly censored stuff. You read the stickers, which are the Dewey Decimal stickers, and then you find the key one. It has a library card. You hold it over a page and read through it, right? Ideally, a well-designed physical puzzle is a combination of bodily interaction, the cognitive challenge of actually solving the puzzle, and the subconscious design cues, right? Looking at the Dewey Decimal System, understanding how a library card works. To understand how to design that, you have to first understand how the players approach solving them. And I will add as well that people are aging out of understanding how libraries work. So this puzzle is not relevant anymore. Yeah. Since I've spoken so much about taking written material out and boiling points down to essentials, I wanted to bring up the game, The Silence, in room 1258, which is entirely conveyed by writing and letters and reading them. Just as an example of like, none of this is like, these are the laws of doing it. You know, this is all borrowed notes and journaling and letters written to other characters, presented as well in a sort of meta-narrative. The story sort of relies on your imagination to fill in the empty spaces. And I wanted to include it because it's presented in a completely different environment. Because it's self-directed, you can allow people the space to sit and read and ponder and imagine what's actually going on. Which brings us to world building. So again, the discussion of what goes into world building is like a day-long conversation. So I'll just say that to draw on archetypes and to create a world in support of the narrative, which is also always moving people forward in that story with a person, a human being inside of that, requires a deep understanding of your motives, your politics, and the messages that you're trying to convey. Spark of Resistance is a spy drama and stuff, but it could also be looked at as a story of one man's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist, right? Like at the end, the players like take down the man, they set off a bomb, the building shakes. But, you know, seen from the outside, totally different political message. So we chose to tell the story that we told, knowing that was what the story actually is outside of the world of that. And from a player perspective, they don't necessarily need to know any of that. It's just a fun adventure for them. So the lessons there. Consider what you need to know and versus what the player needs to intuit versus what they actually need to be conscious of in that moment. And know thyself, you know, just really truly know what you're trying to say about the world that's going into that. So as we draw to a close, I wanted to share some thoughts on immersion. To me, the greatest sin is like promising to deliver this gift of transportation for this amount of time, and then doing something within that space that takes people out of it, right? Like you never want somebody to experience the friction that brings them back to reality. But just like the pattern recognition stuff with the face in the sink, like we're always naturally looking for those seams, right? It's just curiosity is completely normal. So in a way, we're designing against intuitive human nature. So our job as entertainers is to think about that stuff and figure out how to make it not happen. World-breaking stuff can come from a lot of sources. You know, give people a reason to be there. Even a loose fiction, people are willing to suspend disbelief very easily. Design for actual behavior rather than desired behavior. I cannot tell you how many times that comes up. And maybe this is like totally common knowledge to the people in this room, but actually watching people in your spaces is by far the most educational thing that you can do. And I would also ask that everybody consider accessibility. You know, a range of physical motion, people who have limited sight or limited hearing, color blindness is a big one in puzzles. If you design for accessibility, you also accommodate people experiencing temporary disability. Inclusiveness just means that world building continues for people who are in those sort of situations, and everybody gets to experience your story, not just a few people. And yeah, also, if you're designing for the lizard brain, it's all sex and death, right? That's why Sleep No More is so fun, sex and death. So it's not bad, but just be aware of what you're trying to say about those things. So here's my top 10 guidelines on how to approach this, you know, the theory that gets us then into the how-tos. Again, the day-long session. Let the subconscious and imagination of the players do the heavy lifting. You as a designer need to know way more than the players do, and you really should be careful about how much you're telling them. Think about what people actually do versus what you wanted to do. It's usually fairly different. Frustration isn't fun, and I'll say there's a caveat. It can be if it's deliberately designed to be that way, but if it's fun or if it's frustrating because like something is broken, that's sort of the number one thing to avoid. Understand and respect the realities of the human body and brain. In escape rooms, when people are entering that flow state for an hour, they're standing on a concrete floor, they don't notice the time passing. So you need to also be caring for their bodies, which they're not paying any attention to. People remember human interactions, not words on paper. That's why we transferred all of our story to character moments. If it's going to break immersion, take it out, even if it's great. One key will unlock, puzzle specific, but also applies in a larger way. I don't want to be handed 50 keys and then have to try them on every single lock, because it's bringing me back into the drudgery of real world stuff. Every puzzle action, step, or interaction should flow naturally to the next one. Don't just pull random stuff out of the air, and don't make me as a player guess what that is. And if you've done it right, people won't think about it, because it's the friction that makes them aware of it. And so it will appear completely invisible, and it will make it seem like it's easy to do. So thank you.